So here is another episode of Memories of Hometown Heroics, a journey into times of war. So hello, once again, this is Jonathan Moore with Hometown Historian Channel. Today we're doing another episode of Memories of Hometown Heroics, Journey into Times of War. This episode, we're actually taking a trip over to Russia during World War II with a group of women aviators called the Night Witches. In the year 1941, Stalingrad was under siege. German forces were only 20 miles from Moscow, and over 3 million Russian people, soldiers and citizens, had been taken captive, and a lot of people had been killed. It's just in Stalingrad alone, I think at least hundreds of thousands of people had been killed. It was brutal. Like, the German forces were ruthless and without mercy. And really at this time, Russia not only had been stunned by Hitler and the Nazi forces not honoring the compromise that they had come up with, the alliance, if you will, when they had both attacked Poland, and Hitler had thrown that aside and decided, it was really, more than anything, it was an ego war more than anything. And in a lot of ways, if Hitler had just gone to Moscow and taken that, the war could have very well taken a different turn. Instead, he felt, I'm going to stick it to Stalin. I'm going to take the town, the city that has his name. And really at that time, the Russian people did not have a whole lot to be hopeful for. Their forces just did not have the weaponry, the armor, anything to really compete with a German army that was well trained, had all the things that they needed, and just really was taking it to them. So they needed a hero. They needed someone to bring back the hope that they could not only survive, but that they could win. And into that void stepped a Marina Raskovs. She was an aviator that 3 years earlier had done a flight with two of her fellow aviators, female aviators, over Siberia. And now, by the end, the wings had been so iced over, and with the winds and everything, and they had basically thrown everything out of the plane that they could. They eventually had to bail out, but they were national heroes. She was actually really lauded by the Russian government as this is a hero. So she went 3 years later in 41, when they were going through all this with Stalingrad and Moscow, and just things looked very, very dim. She went to Stalin and said, hey, can I create 3 regiments of flyers, of aviators, to go and take on the Germans? And he allowed that. Now, these 3 squadrons that were for the defense of the homeland, they were known as the 586th Fighter Aviation Regiment, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, and the 125th Guards Bomber Aviation Regiment. And they were composed completely of women, from the pilots to the mechanics. And although all the squadrons performed amazing feats, especially considering the circumstances, as we'll go into here further, the 588th became the famous as the Nachthexen, or German for Night Witches, for their daring and tireless night raids on German command posts and tactical targets. They also, part of the reason they were known as the Night Witches is they would come in so low, and we'll explain why they did that, because they were given really inferior aircraft. But it was also because with them flying so low, the sound that it made, they almost were like these women are on brooms, so they were the night witches, but they were a holy terror to the German forces just because of what damage they did and just how often they were there, and we'll talk about that as well. So unfortunately, as is in a lot of cases when you're breaking barriers and things of that nature, and even though these women, what they were doing, and also because of Raskovs' reputation, you would think they would be granted a little bit of respect, but unfortunately there was a lot of prejudice and harassment, including they were provided with these antiquated open cockpit PO-2 biplanes, which had a top speed of 94 miles an hour, and that was actually slower than most World War I era planes, and they could carry only 2 small bombs, but they found ways, these women were ingenious, they found ways to use these crafts to their advantage, and we'll go into that now. So as I was saying, they sort of maximized these planes, which were really outmoded aircraft, even by World War I standards. They learned how to fly low to the ground, as we mentioned earlier. Part of the reasons they were known as the night witches, because they would literally fly as low as like the hedgerows. So, I mean, you're talking 15, 20 feet off the ground. I mean, it's really nuts, but like it wound out really going to their advantage. Also, they learned to cut their engines before reaching their targets, which basically allowed them to glide over the German soldiers undetected until their ordnance had been delivered. Another really cool thing that they did is they would go in groups of 3, and when they went in to bomb, they would sort of, because they were at a disadvantage, especially if you had some kind of dogfights going on, they would have 3 aircraft together. The 2 aircraft, as they went in for a bombing mission, the one on the left would like veer off to the left, the one to the right would veer off, and then it would allow that last plane to sort of go in, glide in, drop its ordnance. They would regather, put the one on the left in the middle, and then do the same maneuver until all 3 had dropped their bombs. And it was just it really worked well. The other thing to their advantage, because of their slow speed, it meant that they could outturn the German Me-109s. Basically, because they were so slow, if the Germans tried to match them, it would stall out their engines, and eventually they just basically gave up on trying to shoot down these slower planes, even though they were promised an Iron Cross if they were able to do so. They had, and then I said about the groups of 3, they did that mainly to penetrate the searchlight and anti-aircraft emplacements, and just basically in general to confuse the enemy, and it really worked very, very well. So let's go into a little bit of the hardships that they went through. This, I don't know what the comparison is. I haven't researched to this degree, but the amount of missions that they ran is insane. And just the hardships being in the Russian frontier and on the front lines where they had their planes brought up quite a few different things as well. You know, Russian is like, you never attack Russia, as Napoleon found out in the winter. It's just a bad idea. Only Russian people can handle it, and they don't enjoy it either, I don't think, except for when you get to wrestle a bear because the bear's warm. So to talk a little bit further into these hardships, they said that some of these women flew as many as 18 missions a night. And during the brutal winter of 1942 to 43, they'd have to lie on the wings of their airplanes to keep the gale force winds and ice from blowing the light craft off the airfield. Because remember, they had these World War I era dual wing, like biplane basically, that even by the World War I standards were, pretty weak. So, I mean, they had to do that kind of stuff. So, I mean, they just went through horrible circumstances, and not only, like we talked earlier about the prejudice that they went through, that really made their job unbelievably more difficult than it needed to be. All told, the 588th completed more than 24,000 combat missions by the end of the war. Sadly, Marina Raskovs was killed in January 1943 while attempting to make an emergency landing. But the squadrons that she formed went on to fight in the skies above Berlin, bringing victory for the Soviet Union. Now, they did wind out ultimately giving her a funeral in Red Square, and these women were very well decorated. 23 of the pilots who served in that all-female 588th Night Bomber, or known as the Night Witches, received or decorated as heroines of the Soviet Union, which is the USSR's equivalent of the Medal of Honor. So these women truly were heroes, and they were a major part in why World War II was won. So in closing, this is one of those stories that I think I had remotely heard about before. Sometimes they have these articles about military history that'll come up on Facebook. I had gotten a couple ideas from those stories, but it sort of went to the back of my mind, and it's a shame. You think about it, is like that these women aren't remembered like they should, and they really took on the impossible and made it possible. So these are women that should be remembered, extraordinary heroes, not just for Russia, but for the world. Because if you didn't have people willing to make these extraordinary sacrifices for freedom, we wouldn't be living in the world that we live in today. And in this world, obviously, it's got problems, got its issues. We all know that, but thankfully, we're not flying under a Nazi flag because of women like this. So they deserve all the respect in the world, and our thanks and gratitude. And I want to say thanks for coming along again. I actually got this story from, it's called The Book of Unusual Knowledge. I got this for Christmas from my sister and brother-in-law. So Debbie and Sean, thank you for that. There's a lot of other really good stuff in there. So those types of things help because it's easier. You don't always find these things, and then you can get brought up and then say research more, get the pictures, and really be able to bring out the truth about these heroic individuals, and so thankful for what they provided, which is our freedom. And I want to thank you once again for coming along on another journey into hometown history. And as always, we will see you all about town.